What happened on the front line this time no longer looks like a typical clash. A group of Russian soldiers on motorcycles rushed across open ground at high speed, as if they were trying to use mobility to pass through the danger zone before Ukraine could react. But in a very short moment, that advantage collapsed. One by one, the motorcycles were hit while still moving. The formation broke apart almost immediately. What makes this scene notable is not only the level of damage, it is the way it happened. Fast, precise, and as if the strike had already been prepared before the unit even entered its attack phase. This is not just a story about Russian motorcycle troops being destroyed by Ukrainian FPV drones on the front line. It is about the survival logic of attacking forces at the front line itself. So what did Ukraine see before those strikes even began? And why is what once looked like a mobility advantage now turning into a fatal weakness for these new types of assaults? Stay with Military Force to find out. Russia has begun pushing motorcycle troops closer to the front line because speed has become one of the few advantages still available under constant pressure. In sectors where armored vehicles face mounting losses, Russian commanders appear to be searching for a cheaper and faster way to move assault groups toward Ukrainian positions. Motorcycles are now being used as a practical tool for that purpose. They allow small teams to advance quickly, pass through narrow tracks, and cross rough ground that would slow or expose heavier vehicles. This matters on a battlefield where every extra minute in the open increases the risk of being targeted. By reducing travel time, these units aim to narrow the window in which Ukrainian forces can respond. The method also reflects a wider battlefield adjustment. Rather than sending larger mechanized columns into danger, Russia is relying more on smaller groups that can move with less preparation and less visible buildup. This does not remove the danger, but it changes the form of the assault. The focus shifts away from heavy protection and toward rapid approach. In simple terms, Russia is trying to preserve offensive momentum by replacing part of its armored push with lighter and more flexible elements. This shift also shows how battlefield pressure is forcing Russian forces to rethink how they reach the line of contact. Heavy armored assaults can still deliver firepower, but they are easier to notice and harder to hide once they begin moving. Motorcycle troops offer a different balance. They carry less protection, yet they give commanders the ability to send forward units that are faster, more scattered, and less dependent on fixed routes. They can exploit gaps, skirt damaged roads, and reach forward areas with less logistical burden than armor. A dispersed attack can create uncertainty and stretch local defenses, especially if several small groups appear at nearly the same time. That gives these troops a clear role in short-range assault activity, where speed and timing may matter more than armor during the first moments of contact. Their use suggests a visible movement away from concentrated thrusts and toward more fragmented attempts to reach Ukrainian positions. Russia is not abandoning mechanized warfare, but it is clearly adding lighter methods to keep pressure on the front. That choice reveals both adaptation and constraint. It shows an effort to stay mobile, but it also points to the growing difficulty of moving larger protected formations safely. Yet on this battlefield, the real issue may not be how quickly these units can arrive. It may be whether they were already seen before the attack truly began. Ukraine's advantage in this phase begins before any explosive drone appears over the target area. The key factor is early detection. Russian motorcycle troops may move faster than heavier vehicles, but that advantage weakens quickly if their approach is discovered well before they reach the defensive line. Reconnaissance drones allow Ukrainian forces to observe movement at a distance and identify which routes are being used. That matters because an assault unit often reveals its intention through direction, spacing, and pace even before contact begins. Open fields, narrow tracks, and repeated approach corridors can all help build a clearer picture of where the force is going. Once those signs are visible, the approaching unit is no longer just moving forward. It is entering an engagement that has already started from above. The next step is rapid transmission of target data. Once motorcycle groups are identified, their coordinates and direction of travel can be passed to FPV teams positioned closer to the front line. This reduces the delay between observation and response. In battlefield terms, that short delay can decide whether an attacking group still has freedom of action or is already under effective threat. Ukrainian units do not need to wait for Russian troops to reach trenches or firing positions before reacting. They can prepare an intercept while the assault is still crossing exposed ground. This shifts the timing of the fight. The clash no longer begins at the point of contact. It begins when the target is found and the strike chain is activated. That timing matters because a force that is still moving has fewer options to hide, reorganize, or build supporting fire around itself. A rapid handoff also increases confidence for the strike team, since the target picture remains fresh and operationally useful at the moment of launch. Continuous tracking is just as important as initial detection. A moving target can change speed, alter direction, or try to use terrain to break visual contact. If surveillance is lost, the value of the first sighting drops quickly. That is why keeping the target under watch matters so much. A motorcycle unit that remains visible can be engaged with much greater confidence because the strike team is working with current information rather than a guess. This keeps pressure on the attacker throughout the approach. Patterns seen near Sloviansk in early 2026 appeared to reflect exactly this kind of rapid reaction model, where the defending side responded so quickly that the assault force struggled to settle, regroup, or shape the attack before facing immediate danger. The result is not just faster response. It is a battlefield rhythm in which the attacker is forced to operate under constant observation from the moment movement begins. What makes this system important is that it turns battlefield awareness into direct combat power. Ukraine is not using drones only to observe in a passive way. It is linking surveillance to action fast enough to affect the battle before the attacker can gain local advantage. That changes the meaning of movement on the front line. Speed still matters, but it no longer guarantees initiative. In some cases, it may even make a target easier to follow across open routes that are already being watched. Dust, spacing, and repeated movement along visible lanes can make a fast unit stand out rather than disappear. It also gives Ukrainian defenders time to judge intent, assign priorities, and prepare follow-on responses if the intercept fails or if additional assault groups appear along the same route. Once the first strike arrives that early, the balance begins to shift. The attacking unit is still moving, but the initiative is already slipping away. And that is the moment when the main advantage of motorcycle troops begins to turn into their clearest weakness in the first decisive minutes of battle. Speed stops protecting motorcycle troops the moment their movement is exposed, and a strike begins to close in. That is the central weakness of this method of assault. A motorcycle can help soldiers cross dangerous ground faster, but it offers almost nothing once the unit is identified and placed under attack. Unlike armored vehicles, it provides no real shield against blast, fragments, or the direct impact of an explosive drone. The rider remains visible, exposed, and dependent on momentum alone. That can work only for a short time. Once an incoming strike is already tracking the target, speed becomes less of a defense and more of a countdown. The vehicle is still moving, but the margin for survival is shrinking with every second. What looked like mobility a moment earlier begins to look like exposure in motion. The problem becomes even more serious on open terrain, where motorcycles stand out more clearly than commanders may expect. They move along visible tracks, throw up dust, and create patterns that are easier to follow from above than a soldier on foot. Their small size does not guarantee concealment if the surrounding ground offers little cover. In fact, speed can make them easier to track because the direction of travel becomes obvious over distance. Once that happens, the rider has few good choices left. Continuing forward means staying on a predictable line. Turning away can slow the unit or separate it from the rest of the assault. Stopping is worse, because the vehicle provides almost no meaningful protection. The motorcycle is therefore caught in a narrow tactical trap. It is too light to defend the rider and too exposed to disappear once surveillance is locked in. That is why being seen early matters so much. That collapse becomes clearer when soldiers are forced to abandon their motorcycles under pressure. The moment they dismount, the unit loses whatever coherence speed had given it. Spacing breaks down. Direction becomes uncertain. Some men run toward cover. Others try to scatter across open ground. A few may attempt to continue the push on foot, but the original assault rhythm is already broken. This is a critical shift in the battle. The unit is no longer moving as one element. It is turning into separated individuals with limited protection, unclear coordination, and little time to recover control. At that stage, survival depends less on speed and more on chance, terrain, and the attacker's reaction time. The strike is no longer aimed only at vehicles. It follows the soldiers themselves. Once individuals are identified outside the motorcycle formation, each person can become a separate target. This is why the destruction of motorcycle troops cannot be understood simply as the loss of light vehicles. The deeper issue is that the logic behind the tactic begins to reverse once contact with a tracking and strike system has already been established. Russia uses these units to gain speed, shorten exposure time, and improve the odds of reaching Ukrainian positions. But if the force is detected soon enough, those same features produce the opposite result. Fast movement reveals direction. Light structure offers no protection. Dispersal turns into fragmentation the moment the unit is hit. Escape on foot becomes difficult once soldiers are isolated in watched terrain. In that environment, speed does not solve vulnerability. It compresses the path to it. The result is a battlefield condition in which adaptation alone is not enough. A force may move faster than before, yet still become easier to destroy once the enemy has learned how to break that pattern in real time. Russia's shift from heavy mechanized formations to lighter and faster assault elements was meant to solve a real battlefield problem. Large armored columns had become easier to identify, channel, and strike before reaching useful positions. By using motorcycle troops and other smaller assault groups, Russian forces appeared to be searching for a different way to keep pressure on the line. The logic was simple. A lighter force could move faster, approach from more than one direction, and avoid presenting the kind of dense target that armored assaults often create. This kind of adjustment made sense in a war where every visible concentration of vehicles carries growing risk. But adaptation only works if it creates a new advantage that the other side cannot quickly exploit. In this case, that did not fully happen. Ukraine did not treat these smaller units as too minor or too fleeting to matter. Instead, it treated them as part of the same battlefield pattern, then adjusted its own methods to match. The change in platform did not remove the attacker from danger. It simply changed the form in which that danger appeared. Ukraine's use of ISR, linked with FPV strike teams, is what turns that adaptation into a liability rather than a solution. A fast-moving target may look harder to hit from the ground, but it can become more visible inside a system built around constant aerial observation. Movement creates signal. Direction creates pattern. Repeated use of likely approach routes creates expectation. Once those elements come together, a force that hoped to become harder to predict can instead become easier to classify and follow. That does not mean speed has no value. It means speed alone cannot defeat a surveillance network that is already watching the battlefield in layers. The faster unit still has to cross terrain. It still has to commit to a route. It still has to enter the window where tracking can be maintained and a strike can be organized. This is the reversal at the center of the problem. Russia tried to reduce vulnerability by becoming lighter and quicker. Ukraine answered by making quick movement itself part of the targeting logic. Instead of escaping the engagement cycle, these units can end up feeding it. That is why this episode matters beyond the destruction of several assault groups. It shows that battlefield adaptation is now a competitive process, not a one-sided fix. One army changes method. The other studies that method, identifies its new signature, and builds a response around it. In this case, Ukraine appears to have moved faster inside that cycle. Russia altered the shape of the assault, but Ukraine altered the conditions under which that assault could survive. That distinction is important. It means the real contest is no longer only about who has more armor or who can move first. It is about who can read battlefield change faster and convert that understanding into immediate action. When that happens, even a sensible adjustment can become a fresh weakness. A unit may be smaller, faster, and more flexible than before, yet still become easier to disrupt if the enemy has learned how to exploit its new behavior. And when a new battlefield solution is neutralized that quickly, the consequences do not stop with the first losses on the ground. These strikes show that movement on the front line is becoming dangerous, almost from the moment it begins. The gap between detection and attack is now so short that units may have little or no time to adjust once they are seen. This changes the meaning of exposure. In earlier phases of war, a force could sometimes survive a brief sighting if it moved fast enough or changed direction quickly. Now that margin appears far thinner. A unit that starts moving without enough cover, masking, or electronic support can be identified before it reaches a useful position. That creates a battlefield where action itself carries immediate danger. The problem is no longer limited to large armored formations. Even smaller groups can be placed at risk if they cross watched ground under constant aerial observation. This pressure affects more than physical survival. It also alters the mental condition of the troops who have to move under those conditions. Soldiers who know they may be seen at any moment are forced to think about exposure before they think about the objective ahead. That slows decision-making. It can also weaken confidence during the most fragile stage of an assault, which is the period before contact is fully established. Every route must be judged not only for speed, but for visibility. Every pause carries the fear of being fixed in place. Every order to advance comes with the knowledge that movement may trigger an immediate response from above. That kind of pressure builds hesitation. It does not always stop an attack, but it can drain momentum from it before the assault reaches its decisive point. The operational effect is equally important. If commanders know that each movement may be detected quickly, they must spend more time managing risk before they can push forces forward. That slows the overall rhythm of attack. Units may move in shorter bounds, wait longer for support, or delay action until conditions appear less dangerous. As a result, tempo becomes harder to sustain. The battlefield begins to favor the side that can impose caution on the other. This is why strikes of this kind matter beyond the immediate ambush. They reveal a front line where mobility is no longer simply an advantage to be used. It is a problem to be managed. That burden affects planning, coordination, and timing at the same time. A force that must constantly hide its own movement cannot attack with full freedom. It must protect the approach before it can shape the fight. That alone can change the balance on the ground effectively. When that happens across repeated engagements, the character of combat begins to shift. Success depends not only on firepower or bravery, but on whether a force can move without becoming visible long enough to function. That is why these attacks point to more than one tactical success. They point to a larger change in the nature of modern war. This episode shows why the war in Ukraine is increasingly being shaped by asymmetric warfare rather than by simple comparisons of armor, weight, or traditional firepower. Ukraine is using low-cost drones together with reconnaissance systems to create damage far greater than the price of the tools being used. That matters because combat effectiveness is no longer decided only by the size of a weapon or the thickness of protection around a vehicle. It is now decided more often by how fast a force can detect, identify, and engage a target before that target can react. In that environment, relatively cheap systems can produce major battlefield effects if they are linked to a fast and disciplined decision process. This changes the idea of military efficiency. A force does not always need the most expensive weapon to cause serious losses. It needs the ability to see first, understand first, and strike first with enough precision. That is why drones are no longer just flying explosives or observation tools. They are becoming part of a larger structure that shapes how the battlefield is used. Their influence now goes beyond destruction alone. Drones affect where units move, when they move, how long they stay exposed, and how much freedom commanders really have once an operation begins. That pressure changes the behavior of both heavy and light forces. A smaller mobile unit may still be easier to deploy and easier to scatter, but it loses much of that value if it remains under continuous observation from above. The same pressure applies to larger formations, which means the old divide between protected movement and unprotected movement is becoming less clear. What matters more is whether a force can break observation long enough to complete its task. This is why the battlefield is changing in ways that reach beyond one intercepted assault. The contest is moving toward information, timing, and fast target handling. A side that can connect surveillance to rapid action can shape enemy behavior before the main clash even begins. That gives cheap systems an influence once associated with far more complex weapons. From that point, the story is no longer only about one group of motorcycle troops being destroyed. It becomes a larger question about how both attacking and defending forces will adapt next under constant eyes in the sky. Russia turned to motorcycle troops to gain speed and reach Ukrainian positions more quickly. This episode shows how limited that advantage has become on a battlefield shaped by constant observation. Ukraine's combination of reconnaissance and FPV strikes disrupted the assault before speed could produce a real tactical benefit. That is the deeper lesson of this encounter. Movement alone no longer creates opportunity if it can be seen, tracked, and hit almost at once. What matters more now is who controls information. What matters is who reacts faster. What matters is who can turn awareness into action with the least delay. This shift is changing the logic of attack itself. Forces that once relied on motion to survive may now need concealment, deception, and stronger coordination just to reach the point of contact. If this pattern continues, future offensives will depend less on moving faster than danger. They will depend more on avoiding detection long enough to fight on favorable terms. War is not only about tactics and weapons, but about the lasting cost on people and societies. Understanding how modern conflict works helps explain why preventing war matters more than ever. If this analysis was useful, like, share, and subscribe to Military Force to stay informed and think deeper about peace and war.